is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3 and House Rule 11, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on any vote relating to any matter under consideration during today's markup. We will be distributing both hard copies and electronic copies of amendments to ensure all members have access to relevant documents in this hybrid format. All amendments must be submitted to the committee email provided in the meeting notice. As is the chair's practice, amendments that are pre-filed will be given priority consideration. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Before I make my opening statement, I would like to take a point of personal privilege to say a few words about the stablecoin legislation that the ranking member and I have been working together on. I want to thank the ranking member and his staff for working with me, my staff, Treasury, and key regulators on legislation that would better regulate stablecoins and require the Federal Reserve to research and develop a central bank digital currency so we remain competitive globally. I would also like to thank the committee members for their thoughtful engagement on this issue. Under my leadership, we've held several subcommittee hearings on digital assets, as well as a series of full committee hearings that were planned in a bipartisan manner with the ranking member, including with the CEOs of the largest crypto companies and key government experts. Although the ranking member, Secretary Yellen, and I have made considerable progress towards an agreement on the legislation, we are unfortunately not there yet and will therefore continue our negotiations over the August recess. It's critical that we continue moving the ball forward on this so we can have a regulatory framework that protects consumers while allowing for responsible innovation. So I look forward to coming to an agreement in the near future and marking up bipartisan legislation when we return from recess. With that, I will recognize the ranking member if he would like to also take a point of personal privilege before his opening statement.
And Madam Chair, I would, and I thank you for your public statements, and I want to thank you for the good work of your team, and your team and my team, and you and I have put a significant amount of effort into achieving a bipartisan outcome. And this is something I've said consistently on stablecoins. That's where we should be able to legislate in a bipartisan way, and you've said similarly. But I think the important thing to say is that we're close. We're not there yet, but we're close. There have been meaningful and quite productive conversations between us and our staffs. In these conversations will continue through the summer. And I think you and I share the goal of getting this done in September, if we can. And the policy has to be right, and I know that's difficult. And bipartisanship is a difficult undertaking. But most importantly, I think I want to convey that we want to make sure that this bill, that this law, is technically proficient and a workable law. We don't want a dead letter as soon as we pass this thing. We want a workable law. And furthermore, we are interested in building off the expertise and data that we have from existing states and their existing regimes. Most significantly, the state of New York has the most robust stablecoin regime, and I think we want to make sure that we're adhering to those best practices and the data that's available there. But as I said, this needs to be. This is a technical piece of legislation. We need to make sure that it is technically proficient and workable. And I'm really grateful for your leadership in this undertaking, and very grateful that we can coordinate from my side of the aisle, your side of the aisle, along with the administration, and get a workable product. So thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back. And
Thank you.
Final note, I do want to say in particular, thank you to the Republican staff here on the Financial Service Committee and the Democrat staff here on the Financial Services Committee to work long, long hours and have significant work and debates, yes, but progress. And I'm grateful for that undertaking and want to thank them in particular. So thanks so much. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McHenry. I thank you very much with all that you have said, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for opening remarks. Today, this committee comes together for a markup of 9 bills. These bills exemplify the hard work that each one of our members have dedicated to addressing urgent housing needs, protecting consumers, and taking other steps to help improve the world we live in. Specifically, this markup includes a slate of bills to strengthen oversight of our country's affordable housing and give communities the tools they need to address the homeless crisis. H.R. 2965, the Naomi Swartz Safe Parking Act, a bill led by Representatives Carbajal and Vargas, will allow communities to use federal homelessness funds to create safe parking lots where individuals experiencing homelessness can legally and safely park their cars overnight and be connected to supportive services and housing. Representative Sylvia Garcia's bill, H.R. 7123, Studying Barriers to Housing Act, will require a study to identify barriers that public housing authorities face in coordinating with local homeless service providers to help those experiencing homelessness. And then there's H.R. 8476, the Housing Inspections Accountability Act of 2022, led by Representative Ocasio-Cortez, will improve the oversight of federally assisted housing by requiring HUD and USDA to publicly report information about properties which failed inspection scores annually to Congress. Committee Democrats are also working to protect and empower consumers by putting them in charge of their own financial future. As such, we will mark up Representative Maloney's bill, H.R. 4277, the Overdraft Protection Act of 2021, which will crack down on predatory overdraft fees. Representative Williams' bill, H.R. 8485, the Expanding Access to Credit through Consumer Permissioned Data Act, gives consumers with little or no information on their credit files the power to leverage their own financial data, not typically included in their credit report, to demonstrate credit worthiness and expand access to affordable credit. Representative Presley's bill, H.R. 8478, the Credit Reporting Accuracy After a Legal Name Change Act, will ensure that transgender and non-binary individuals do not lose their credit history after legally changing their names, and prevents an individual's former name from being shared with a creditor. We're also marking up bipartisan bills to simplify bureaucratic processes. Representatives Vargas's bill, H.R. 6889, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act, will apply reforms that California and other states have adopted for state-chartered credit unions by reducing the monthly meeting requirement to be bi-monthly for federal credit union boards. H.R. 4865, the Registration for Index-Linked Annuities Act, led by Representatives Adams, will help to harmonize registration requirements for registered index-linked annuities with those of other annuities products and ensure that resulting forms are subject to investor testing. And lastly, we will be marking up my bill, H.R. 8484, the aligning SEC regulations for the World Bank's International Development Association Act, which will provide the International Development Association, or IDA, which provides assistance to the world's poorest countries with the same exemption from securities regulations that other multilateral development banks have, thereby expanding its ability to support people around the world. So I'm very pleased that each of the bills we're marking up today will work to further protect our communities and better address some of our nation's most pressing needs. So I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for any opening remarks he may have.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And this may not be a surprise to you, but in my opening, I'm going to talk a little bit about inflation. I know that my Democrat colleagues will be shocked that this is a concern of mine, but it's a concern of our constituents, and I want to raise that in this hearing markup. So let's take a quick look at the headlines from this week. The Wall Street Journal: the U.S. middle class is getting squeezed in 2022. Bloomberg: difficulty paying bills tops pandemic high in U.S. Census survey. Fox Business: businesses are spending more to stay afloat while economic optimism drops. And CNBC: the numbers show the U.S. economy is at least teetering on a recession. These are the issues that the American people are talking about and what they care about. But here we are with a largely partisan markup again. And what I would ask is that we focus on the big issues that the American people care about, especially at this point in the congressional calendar. There have been bright spots in this committee. Certainly, when Republicans and Democrats work together on legislation in response to Putin's aggression and invasion of Ukraine. But those have been few and far between, unfortunately. And then beyond that, where we are in the congressional calendar is with an eye to elections, and you can see this on who's got bills on the docket today. No Republicans, but all Democrats, and all Democrats that are trying to position themselves for re-election rather than advance the causes of the American people. They're trying to advance their political causes. Give you an example. We'll consider a bill today that prevents credit reporting agencies from including prior names in a credit report. How does that help and strengthen underwriting and lower the cost of credit for families who really need it? It doesn't. We'll also consider a bill that might appear benign in that it recognizes the benefits of alternative forms of credit for loans. Okay, that's good. We agree that is a laudable goal. But what it really does is it saddles mortgage lenders with unnecessary and costly regulation. It also grants Democrats' favorite regulator, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, with broad authority to write rules for mortgage creditors. And that won't help anyone. Next up on the docket is a bill to require the Department of Agriculture and Housing and Urban Development to submit yet another annual report, this time on federally assisted properties that are failing inspections. Instead, shouldn't we work to actually fix the problems that this reporting would identify and fix the problems in federally assisted housing? We'll dig into the rest of the bills as they come up, sure, but I'll just remind my friends across the aisle that these bills are going nowhere. They won't make it in the Senate, and they're not bipartisan. And this is an exercise that is much more about election year politics than addressing the horrible record on the economy. But as the Biden administration has learned time and time again, it's hard to sneak one over on the American people. Changing the definition of recession or touting a Biden boom doesn't change the fact that 80% of Americans agree the economy is on the wrong track. So I hope after a month of hearing directly from their constituents, my Democrat colleagues will come back in September ready to work with Republicans to tackle these issues. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back and look forward to a good markup.
Thank you very much. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up the resolution to reauthorize the Artificial Intelligence Task Force and the resolution to reauthorize the Financial Technology Task Force, and ask for unanimous consent that the resolutions be adopted. Without objection, such is the order. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 6889, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 6889, a bill to amend the Federal Credit Union Act to modify the frequency of Board of Directors meetings and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the
Without
Senate.
objection, the first reading of H.R. 6889 is dispensed with. The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6889, offered by Mr. Vargas of California. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendments. I now recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes to explain the bill and his amendment.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for allowing me to present H.R. 6889, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act. Currently, federal law requires all federally chartered credit unions to meet at least once a month. However, this outdated requirement has placed a burden on credit union staff and their board members, especially smaller credit unions and those in rural areas. The amount of resources it takes for a credit union to run a monthly board meeting can shift employee time away from services that a credit union provides for its customers and its community. My bill, H.R. 6889, the Credit Union Modernization Act, is an overwhelmingly bipartisan piece of legislation that would allow the boards of federal credit unions to meet at least every other month instead of every month. A large share of state-chartered credit unions allow board meetings less frequently than every month, or even allow meetings on an as-needed basis. Therefore, this legislation would bring institutionally sound federal credit unions in line with many state-chartered credit unions and board meeting policy. Specifically, credit unions with a composite rating of either 1 or 2 under the Uniform Institutions Rating System would be required to meet at least 6 times annually, with at least 1 meeting held during each fiscal quarter. To mitigate the risk of institutional failure, de novo federal credit unions would be required to meet at least monthly during the first 5 years of their charter, as well as federal credit unions with composite ratings of either 3, 4, or 5, or with a capability of management rating of either 3, 4, or 5. Additionally, if emergencies or issues arise requiring a board meeting, credit unions would still be able to meet as frequently as needed. Lastly, and importantly, I would like to thank my colleague, Representative Anthony Gonzalez, for his partnership on this important matter. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Representative Vargas for offering 6889, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act. This common sense bill would modernize requirements for federal credit union board meetings to bring highly rated federal credit unions in line with state credit union charter requirements in 17 states, including my state of California. Under this bill, federal credit unions that are highly rated by their regulator, including those that have a highly rated management team, would be required to meet 6 times annually, with at least 1 meeting held during each fiscal quarter, reducing the current requirement to meet monthly. To ensure stability and mitigate the risk of institutional failure, this bill retains certain safeguards. For example, de novo federal credit union boards would be required to meet at least monthly during the first 5 years of the charter, as well as federal credit unions that receive low exam ratings. Additionally, if emergencies or issues arise requiring a board meeting, nothing in the bill prevents federal credit unions from meeting more frequently. I appreciate that these reforms are structured in a way to incentivize federal credit union boards to ensure their institutions are highly rated and well-run. I urge members to support H.R. 6889, and I yield back the balance of my time. Is there further discussion of or amendment to H.R. 6889? If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 6889 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And H.R. 6889 is agreed to. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 2965, the Naomi Swartz Safe Parking Act of 2022. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2965, a bill to require the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to establish a grant program.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 2965 is dispensed with. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Vargas, a co-sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2965, offered by Mr. Vargas of California. Strike all after enacting.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes to explain the bill and his amendment. What is this?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry,
I believe
please.
you-
From
I believe you mean,
California. We had a little mistake here on there. Thank you.
No worries, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. I like New York too. In fact, I like every state. I'd be proud to be from New York, but I'm a Californian. Again, thank you very much, Madam Chair. On behalf of my good friend Salud Carbajal, it is my pleasure to discuss the need for the Naomi Swartz Safe Parking Act of 2022. During these challenging economic times, many individuals experiencing homelessness utilize their vehicles as emergency shelters because local shelters have no available beds or have imposed policies limiting habitation. Unfortunately, when individuals rely on their vehicles as a last resort to avoid sleeping on the street, they often face criminal penalties and safety risks as a result. Under HUD's Emergency Solutions Grant, or ESG, communities can receive funds for emergency shelter and provide services to people experiencing homelessness. However, under current regulations, ESG funds cannot be used for safe parking facilities. In a survey of 187 cities, the National Homelessness Law Center reported that about 50% of cities had one or more laws restricting living in vehicles. To address this problem, this bill would allow communities to use ESG funds to create safe parking lots where individuals experiencing homelessness can legally and safely park their cars overnight and connect to supportive services. This bill simply grants safety parking programs to eligible uses of emergency solutions. This does not require increased funding, but adds more flexibility for communities to address the unique needs of their communities. Madam Chair, too many of us take housing for granted. Having a roof over our heads and food on our tables is a blessing. Every night, there are over 580,000 Americans that experience homelessness. And we need to come together on a bipartisan basis and give people a safe, designated place to park so that individuals do not have their cars towed in the middle of the night or become financially burdened with unneeded tickets, especially as these Americans work to get back on their feet and care for their families. I'm very proud to support this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. I have to say that in the 10 years that I've been here, I try to go to the prayer breakfasts on Thursday, and I've been impressed with the personal stories that a lot of my colleagues have. And interestingly, many have told of times when they had to sleep in their car and sometimes with their families just to get by. And again, I think that this is a very good bill, a needed bill, and I urge support. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
I do indeed strike the last word. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I rise in opposition to my friend from California's bill. And let me talk to you about some of the reasons why. You know, homelessness is and continues to be a real problem across our country. And according to HUD's annual point-in-time count, on a single night in 2020, roughly 580,000 of our citizens in the U.S. were homeless, and 39% of which were unsheltered. This continues to be a multi-year increase in homelessness, marked most notably by the dramatic rise of unsheltered homelessness in many high-cost states like my good friend Mr. Vargas's state of California. From 2007 to 2015, homelessness saw a national decline of roughly 15%. But 2016, the national rate of homelessness has risen about 5%. In my own hometown of Little Rock, Arkansas, we work mightily in our very caring community and our homeless outreach coordination effort with Jericho Way, Our House, St. Francis House, Union Rescue Mission, the Salvation Army, a whole group working with our homeless citizens, both veterans and non-veterans, to make sure that we have a continuum of care for them. And I particularly am grateful to County Judge Barry Hyde in Pulaski County, Arkansas, who is innovating even further for those who are chronically unsheltered. But California now accounts for 51%, more than half of the entire national unsheltered homeless population, and 28% of all homelessness across our country. Other high-cost states like New York, Hawaii, and Oregon have similar high rates of homelessness, while other states have per capita homelessness rates below the national average. These increases are due in part to HUD's reliance on what many of us on this side of the aisle believe is a misguided policy called Housing First, which prohibits federal funding from flowing to homeless service providers that combine shelter with treatment, like sobriety, substance abuse, or mental health treatment requirements. The more successful strategy that we believe in is called Housing Plus. Instead of Housing First, advocates have worked to exclude Housing Plus providers from funding and want the Housing First model of unconditional shelter to be the only model used. In fact, in 2016, Housing First was first adopted as the official state policy in California. Housing First being the only housing option in California and elsewhere has given rise to the bill we have before us today. Now, this bill is not supposed to end homelessness, and I certainly know that, and all of our colleagues know that. But I don't think I can support a bill that tries to reduce it by having people experiencing homelessness live in their cars. Cars are clearly not meant for human habitation, and encouraging their use such as this poses clear health and public safety risks, both to those in the car and those in the neighborhood around it. This, even if a city uses grants under H.R. 2965 to put up some fences around the parking lot or instead install portable toilets. Whatever the good intentions of the proponents of this idea might be, the plain reality is that using federal grants to tell people to live in their cars is an inadequate and degrading approach to dealing with the very real problem that we're all concerned about, which is homelessness. It's worth noting that in some places, like California's Los Angeles, they've used taxpayer money to experiment with government-run parking lot campsites. The cost of these campsites are over $2,600 per participant per month. which is higher than the median rent for a one-bedroom apartment in the city and far higher than the cost of providing participants a congregate shelter for their temporary needs. So it's with reluctance, because of my dear friendship with Mr. Vargas, that I rise and speak in opposition of H.R. 2965. I think it's the wrong solution to a chronic, desperate problem that we're trying to find bipartisan solutions for, not only here in Congress, but in our own hometowns. And I urge members to oppose this legislation. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Barr is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do also strike the last word, and I want to thank my friend from Arkansas for his persuasive comments in opposition to this bill. I join him in opposing this bill, and let me just say first and foremost that I applaud my friend from California, Mr. Vargas, for his concern about the people who experience the plight of homelessness. And I know Mr. Vargas, and so I know his deep faith and his care for his fellow human being and his genuine desire to help people who are struggling in poverty and in homelessness. So I know his heart is in the right place, and I know he cares about people, and maybe in the worst scenario, a car is the only place you got to go, and if it's raining outside or cold or whatever, that's where you have to go. But the truth is, we have to recognize that what you subsidize is what you get. And our objective should not be to have people living in cars or trucks. Our goal should be to help people escape homelessness and have a real situation of shelter. And I have many concerns with this bill, but let me start with what seems to be the core problem. The bill subsidizes homelessness in communities around the country. It subsidizes people living in vehicles. Telling people to sleep in their cars as a matter of federal policy is not only inadequate and unacceptable, it's cruel. It's cruel. It's cruel because it is the embodiment of the failed Housing First approach. Aside from being a deplorable policy, this bill creates an unnecessary new use of homelessness funds at HUD when there are already pre-existing HUD grant programs that can be used. But this use of homelessness funds that would subject this policy to Housing First would prevent the funds from being contingent on participating in case management. Again, what you subsidize is what you get, and this bill would subsidize homeless individuals living in vehicles with no case management or plan to escape homelessness. We should not restrict federal homelessness funding to Housing First when we know it's a failed strategy and has only exacerbated need and increased homelessness in our country. But there is a way to reduce and prevent this. There's a way to reduce and prevent homelessness. There's a way to reduce and prevent the sad and tragic situation of people having to resort to sleeping in their vehicles. And that is Housing Plus. My bill, the Housing Plus legislation. This bill would prohibit the HUD Secretary from blocking, limiting, or otherwise restricting the award of continuum of care funds to providers because they require wraparound services such as addiction treatment or job counseling, or because they are a faith-based organization. Because in fact, these organizations are effective. They help people escape a life of living in vehicles. They help people get on their feet. And this bill would ensure that HUD grant funding is reaching providers who actually are helping people transition from homelessness into self-sufficiency without unneeded restrictions. Increasing the number of providers who can receive these continuum of care funds and supporting wraparound services to help end this circle of homelessness will help us reduce this crisis. My bill will do this. And instead of supporting bills that just subsidize more homelessness, that subsidize people living in vehicles, bills that will not end homelessness but actually exacerbate homelessness, we need to be focused on common sense legislation like Housing Plus that will truly have an impact on this issue. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation. I urge my colleagues to consider enlarging the universe of providers that can help individuals who find themselves in this crisis of living in their vehicle and actually help these people find an alternative to that. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Representative Vargas and Representative Carbajal for their work on H.R. 2965. As our country's affordable housing crisis has grown more severe, more people are experiencing unsheltered homelessness at alarming rates. This includes people who utilize their vehicles as an alternative to emergency shelter because local shelters have no available beds or have imposed higher barrier policies, such as curfews and limitations on personal belongings, or for other reasons. In my district alone, the point-in-time count data from 2019 reveal that 40% of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in Los Angeles County relied on vehicles for shelter. Unfortunately, when individuals rely on their vehicles as a last resort to avoid sleeping on the street, they often face criminal penalties and safety risks as a result. For example, in 2018, a man experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles was tragically killed when a hit-and-run driver slammed into his parked car on the street that he used for shelter. H.R. 2965 allows communities to use their emergency solutions grant funds to establish safe parking facilities where individuals experiencing homelessness can legally and safely park their cars overnight and be connected to supportive services and permanent housing. Now, I want to be clear. This bill is not going to end homelessness. We already passed a bill to do that, and it's called Build Back Better. We provided $150 billion to address the affordable housing crisis. This bill is a humane response to the reality we live with lawmakers refusing to make the types of investments needed across the country. So I want to thank Mr. Vargas again for his work on this issue. And let me just say that Mr. Hill again identified the homelessness that we're experiencing in California and in Los Angeles in particular. And Mr. Barr talked about on a rainy night that, you know, people are grateful that they have a car that they can sleep in, and they want to be in a safe place in order to do it. It's one thing to talk about not wanting to support any actions this bill in order to ensure that on a rainy night, that when there are no beds and no place to go, and it's danger on the streets, et cetera, and children need to be able to go to school even in the worst of circumstances, that if they have a car to sleep in, and we know many stories about children who are going to school after sleeping in a car at night, if it's in a safe place and they have assistance in getting ready for school, that means everything. It's one thing to talk about the government not subsidizing people sleeping in cars. We don't want people sleeping in cars. This is not, you know, a bill to end homelessness. This is emergency. This is temporary. This is people who have no place to go. This is people who would welcome their government supporting them to have a decent place on a rainy night, a safe and secure place in order to lay their heads until they can do better. And they go on list. There are processes that identify people in these kinds of circumstances to see that they are available for beds when they open up in several different ways. So I wish that my friends would have a heart. And while they may not like emergency support for people who want to sleep in a car or their cars, I would ask them to open their hearts and understand that if there's no other alternative, that we should temporarily support those who on that rainy night that Mr. Barr talked about have a place for them and perhaps their children to sleep. I yield back the balance of my time. Is there further discussion of our amendment to H.R. 2965? If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
Oh, sorry, none of that. Next.
The question now occurs on ordering 2965 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those
Aye.
opposed,
Aye.
no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
And now ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, the vote on this question is postponed. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 7123, the Studying Barriers to Housing Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 7123, a bill to require the Government Accountability Office to conduct a study to identify barriers to reducing homelessness by providing housing assistance under the public.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 7123 is dispensed with. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of the substitute to H.R. 7123, offered by Ms. Garcia of Texas. Strike all after.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas for 5 minutes to explain the bill and her amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for helping me bring this to the table, the Studying Barriers to Housing Act. This is really a very, very simple, common sense bill. Often we've heard our friends across the aisle talk about, well, we need data, we need research. How do we know that? You know, can we look at some evidence? Well, this bill would just do just that. As we know, the nation's homelessness crisis has been worsening since 2016, and it has only gotten worse since COVID-19 pandemic. This bill is designed to address the issue of homelessness and to find solutions so that all our constituents can have a safe, stable place to call home. I agree with you, Madam Chair, and our friends across the aisle. We don't want to see people in cars, but we need to find out why they're in cars and find solutions to make sure that that doesn't happen. I know in my district and the surrounding area, the most recent coalition for the homelessness of Houston point-at-time count found that there are 3,223 individuals experiencing homelessness. This is just one point in time. I'm glad to say that this number marks a significant decrease in the last decade, but it's still unacceptable for any one of my constituents to have to face homelessness. The City of Houston's homelessness efforts have been impressive lately, with more than 7,700 people rehoused to the city's community COVID housing program. I'm proud of the city's efforts, but nevertheless, homelessness continues both in Houston and across the nation. It is important to make sure that the federal systems we have in place are working properly to mitigate homelessness and to keep those people out of living in their cars. This legislation will instruct the GAO to conduct a study and produce a report on reducing homelessness through public housing and Section 8 assistance. The report will examine the barriers that public housing assistance agencies face when serving individuals experiencing homelessness. Specifically, the study will examine laws and regulations, harmful maximums on housing choice vouchers, access to fair housing, and coordination of federal funding outreach. While our nation has systems in place to address homelessness and offer assistance, we must make sure that they're working properly and efficiently and getting to the root of the problem. This study will identify issues in our existing systems so that we may eventually streamline and improve homelessness, responsive to both my district and across the nation. No one in the United States should have to face homelessness, but tragically, too many individuals do. I'm working to change that locally, and we need to do that nationally. Madam Chairwoman, I'm pleased to say that the National Low Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities support our bill. And just to illustrate what some of the barriers are, just this very week, we had an article, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to introduce it for the record, an article about a neighborhood's new anti-Section 8 rules will push many Black residents out of North Texas suburb. Madam Chair, we've discussed often how sometimes people will, some landlords just will not take Section 8 vouchers. Well, there's some homeowners associations that put it in their restrictions. Now we're finding cities put it in their ordinances, and this is an article I would like to submit for the record. I ask for unanimous consent. Madam Chair, I ask for unanimous consent.
Thank you very much. Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to sum it up, this is just a very common sense, simple, 3-page bill to get a study done by GAO to get to the root of the problem, check the barriers, find solutions, and make recommendations. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do move to strike the last word, and I want to thank my friend from Texas for proposing this bill today. And I'd like to say to the majority, this is one of those bills that had there'd been outreach with the staff, it's possible that we could have found a way to work together on it, because certainly studying the barriers to housing, better use of HUD housing programs, both in public housing and in the choice voucher program, is of interest to members on this side of the aisle. And of course, as we talked about in the last bill, there are many issues around the chronic challenges of homelessness that members on this side of the aisle also care about. And let me make a few general comments and then talk a little bit about the bill itself. Time and time again throughout the federal government's response to COVID-19, the majority in the House and Democrats across Washington have attempted to remove any type of minimum safeguards on ensuring that housing assistance actually goes to those the most vulnerable low-income families, or in the case of the pandemic, those who actually were hurt by the pandemic and as a result of ongoing challenges in the pandemic. Perhaps the worst of that, and we've talked about it in this committee many, many times over the last 2 years, is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, where the Biden administration's multiple rewrites of the program rules and absolute failure to properly administer the program resulted in the removal of the requirement that renters actually prove that they had lost income during the pandemic. Instead, the Treasury Department allowed renters applying for government assistance to, quote, self-attest, close quote, with no proof that they were financially impacted by the pandemic or that they were even eligible as low-income households. The Biden administration simply said, open quote, close enough, close quote. And countless taxpayer dollars were scammed away, never actually making it to low-income renters hit the hardest by the pandemic, as Congress intended. And in fact, House Republicans, led by the ranking member, Mr. McHenry, worked very hard in the original CARES Act to make sure that this assistance was targeted towards those who most needed it, people in arrears, people in low incomes, people near eviction, and prioritize that. All those safeguards, all those guardrails were taken away by the Biden administration's rescue plan and by regulation at the Treasury, to the point now where you don't even have to have a landlord involved in rental assistance. So we're seeing the consequences of this, in my view, poor policy throughout Arkansas, where now the Department of Human Services in our state has suspended the program entirely, and the legislature has a fraud investigation going on due to what's happened in rental assistance. The Government Accountability Office, of course, saw the obvious flaws in this approach and criticized the Biden administration's approach by saying, Without procedures to monitor and evaluate required safeguards, Treasury cannot have reasonable assurance that grantees have met the program requirements and effectively managed risk. So that's why this study and the study outline is got to be carefully considered, because it specifically requires documentation requirements, how they prevent public housing authorities from providing rental assistance to new households. While Republicans have discussed for years the need to deal with benefits cliff related to our support for low-income families, when a family moves towards self-sufficiency, it's important that H.R. 7123 is written in such a way as would remove means testing altogether potentially. Providing housing assistance to households who don't actually need it is bad policy. And Congress has a responsibility to low-income families who truly need assistance and make sure they get the assistance and not to others. So I reluctantly oppose this bill and wish that there'd been an opportunity presented by the majority staff or members to work with our staff to make it more acceptable on a bipartisan basis. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Representative Sylvia Garcia for introducing H.R. 7123. In my district, the local public housing authorities, or PHAs, including the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles and Los Angeles County Development Authority, are working hard to help house people experiencing homelessness, but have run up against certain program rules and requirements that limit their ability to serve this population. This includes the limit on the number of vouchers they can project base to support the development of new permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. H.R. 7123 would require the Government Accountability Office to conduct a study to identify these kinds of barriers. The Emergency Housing Voucher Program has helped to break down institutional silos to ensure PHAs and local homeless systems are collaborating more effectively to move families from homelessness into housing. We need to further study the strategies that have worked so well in the EHV program, as well as any additional barriers that PHAs face to improve our federal response to end homelessness. H.R. 7123 will help us to do just that. And to my colleague, Mr. Hill from Arkansas, I'm surprised, not only at your opposition to helping people who have no other place to live but in their parked cars, but I'm further surprised that you have taken time just a moment ago to talk about problems in the program. And basically, you discussed what you consider is documented fraud that has taken place. Yet, you object to a study that may bring out all of the details about what's wrong with our homelessness programs. If, in fact, you're worried that there are those who are taking advantage of the money that we are spending on homelessness, why would you object to a study? I would like, if the gentleman would like to take time to share with us why, in fact, he would resist a study that may bring out the accusations that he's making.
Is the gentlewoman yielding?
I'm yielding to the gentleman from Arkansas.
I thank my friend from California. My comments were about the dangers of not setting standards or qualifications in government programs generally. I was not suggesting about fraud in the voucher program. I was talking about the clear evidence of fraud in the American Rescue Plan rental assistance program that is rampant in this country and will be a real scandal as it comes out with future GAO research and even HUD research on that, and what I'm seeing in my own legislature. And my point was that in the gentleman from Texas's opening remarks about the bill, and even in your prepared comments, we're talking about removing requirements to qualify for vouchers, expanding it, making it easier, lowering documentation. And I was using the rental assistance program purely as an example to say of the dangers of that if one does it. So I hope that,
Reclaiming my time.
I yield back to the,
I want to thank you for your explanation, but you did take the time when the discussion was focused on Ms. Garcia's legislation, when we are talking about homelessness. And what you implied in your remarks, I do believe, was that this study was not necessary when I heard you say that you are concerned about the fact whether you were talking about homelessness or other programs or rental assistance, that there needs to be research done that would make them more cost-effective, that would remove barriers, et cetera, et cetera. And with that, I thank you very much for your remarks, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Time. And I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I yield to my friend and leader, Mr. Hill.
thank you, Mr. McHenry from North Carolina. Thank you. And again, let me say that there wasn't an effort made, even though this bill was noticed back in February by the staff, to try to amend it in such a way that it might become bipartisan and have Republican priorities as well in such a GAO proposed study about how to improve both public housing aspects of supporting our low-income families in a public housing unit or giving them access to a voucher. And again, I would just simply say, these programs, public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program, are not per se solely to try to get homeless people off the streets, but they're to support low-income families to have more options in trying to have a home. So it's not per se a homelessness eradication study. It is about ways that we could make the voucher program more accountable, more successful, more effective, something that in the past this committee has done on a bipartisan basis. So I thank my friend, the ranking member from North Carolina. I yield back to him.
Thank you very much.
And
The gentleman,
yeah, if
Is
I may conclude,
recognized.
on this, I think there is goodwill here for us to address homelessness. We've had a fulsome and real debate about how we think best to do that. And what we should do is not penalize states that have different regimes and allow those states to make their decisions for themselves rather than be prescriptive at the federal level. We've covered that on Housing First, but and those debates are real and sincere. But on this, Mr. Hill outlines in substance, if we want a study like this, there is no reason why we shouldn't both get the benefits. Both parties get the benefit of the questions we think that need to be answered. And there's no reason why a bill like this shouldn't exclude Republican questions and research, especially on something as important as homelessness. So I would make the commitment to work with the sponsor going forward so that we can address that. And if it's not going to be addressed today, I understand that's the majority's decision. But it is my hope that if that's not addressed this markup, we can address that next year in a new Congress. And we can both have language and questions we want answered and data we want provided that is equitable to both sides of the aisle. And that's the intention.
will the gentleman yield to the gentlelady from Texas to respond to your offer?
Sure.
Well, I thank the ranking member for his offer, but I believe that my staff had attempted to work with the committee staff and some staff members, and that, quite frankly, it's appeared to us to be just a question of partisanship over people, and the posture was, we're going to oppose the bill, period. There did not seem to be a willingness to sit down and talk about this, so convince me that this is a genuine offer of goodwill and
Well, reclaiming my time, I understand you're new to Congress, but the sincerity I've tried to show.
I object to your characterization. I am not new to Congress. I am completely
Well,
second term.
taking personalities here and asking about my sincerity when I say this, I've got a record of performance on sincerity here. And you may say you don't think this is a sincere offer, which is what is you've implied. When my staff who works on housing says they don't even know your staffer's name. So I got questions at the staff level, but if I make an offer like that, you can either take it or not take it. And if that's the member's disposition, you certainly have the votes to get it this Congress. I wish you well then, and we'll deal with it next Congress. If you too have a sincere interest with working with us, we will take that. And I
Will the
don't
gentleman
question your
yield?
sincerity. I do not question your sincerity on that, and I've seen your performance here, and that's why I think it's important when you see folks of goodwill saying we have a difference of opinion here, you should accept that at face value. Madam Chair, happy to yield.
Thank you for yielding. The gentlelady has made it quite clear that she wants to proceed with this bill today, and she has rejected your offer.
Good
I
talk.
yield
Well,
back to the
happy,
gentleman.
reclaiming my time. Good talk, right? We can have a difference of opinion. You guys have the votes. I wish you well. But we will still address this issue in the next Congress and get to, I think, what should be an equitable set of questions about really important issues like
The
homelessness.
committee will stand in recess. A vote has been called.
working, she works for the chief of staff. But she's trying to keep the trains running on time. It's just impossible. So she's trying to have people in Arkansas, doing this, people up here in Oregon.
I talked to her a few days after I told Ryan Carney, who was Congressman Smiles' chief of staff.
Yeah.
And I actually interviewed to intern for me this summer.
Yeah.
It was just a few days after I started working on stuff.
Are you based in the area or?
Yeah. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. Thank you. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, so I'm from right around here.
Honestly, I mean, you have your one internship down. Still in college.
Yeah.
It's like, I think underrated doing fall or spring internships. There's less people going to the same spots.
Yeah.
I don't know what year you are in college, but it's never been this stagnant. Honestly, where it's and stuff. So if you know Hannah, you're fresh now. So just stay in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
Happy to. We're always sort of on a rolling basis. Stuff. So.
Do you have a card?
I can. You want to like write down a number or email?
Yeah, maybe I'll just.
We work in the same basement building. She's from Representative Sam is my district representative, so I've been in his office a few times.
Oh, I didn't know that was.
Our like semester long internships, I guess they're not more popular than this one. How many interns would you say do this semester?
You actually read it? Let's say.
What's up, Matt? Average of.
Oh, is there a depends on point style? We're usually desperate to run all day. People just
Yeah.
butts and sleeves.
After this year and here, they're hoping they have these constituent meetings.
We're like, we're usually desperate trying to fill spots. Whereas at some boards, it's usually more happening. Yeah, I mean, seriously, like, if you want to turn in our office, like,
Yeah, I'll definitely reach out. I go to SMU in Dallas during the year, so I'm not here during fun.
summer, what year are you?
I'm going into my junior year.
So this is your summer internship?
Yeah.
You said you're with Weird Al Style.
Yeah.
If there's a summer. Buy it now.
I know.
Yeah, just, first hill internship's always interesting, just to feel it out. Some people hate it,
I really like it.
Yeah, like that. Yeah, that's awful. It's annoying. So if you do it and you like it, you want to go back. There's always spots.
Yeah.
For sure. Depending on what you want to do, like, if you want to work full time,
Is there further discussion of or amendment to H.R. 7123? If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 7123 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, the vote on this question is postponed. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 8476, the Housing Inspections Accountability Act of 2022. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 8476, a bill to require the Secretaries of Housing.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 8476 is dispensed with. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8476, offered
Without
by.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York for 5 minutes to explain the bill and her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the committee as well for holding this markup today. H.R. 8476 is a relatively straightforward bill. This bill will require HUD and the USDA to submit a joint report to Congress regarding failed property inspections of federally assisted housing. So if your public housing or any federally assisted housing fails a fire inspection, a property inspection of any kind, we should know that. And that is the essential, that is the essential meaning of this bill. Those reports should also be made publicly available through an online database that protects identifiable information so that the public also knows which of these federally assisted housing needs help and has failed property inspections. We have seen, however, how much the lack of this transparency affects people's lives. In just January of this year, 17 innocent people in the Bronx tragically lost their lives in an apartment fire, and it was entirely preventable. A New York Times investigation found that none of these residents actually lost their lives due to the actual fire, but they lost them due to the main safety system in the apartment failing, where deadly smoke escaped the apartment and rapidly filled the building's 19 stories. We need greater transparency of the physical condition of federally assisted housing units so that these tragedies do not happen again and so that we understand the scale and scope of the work to be done. It's a common sense reporting requirement to increase transparency, and it's a very simple bill that would help ensure inspections lead to real accountability so that once an inspection is failed, we can actually do something about it and know about it. And with that, I yield back to the chairman.
Is there further discussion of or amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chair,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We will pause to allow copies of the amendment to be distributed electronically. Have all members received the amendment? If so, I would like to reserve a point of order on this amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 84.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I get concerned when I hear stories about families living in substandard housing conditions and the health and safety risks that those problems pose to residents, especially children. Addressing those health and safety risks ought to be a priority at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Instead of actually fixing those hazards, the bill we have before us today takes a more passive focus on highlighting some of the known hazards, which is less than ideal. Of course, transparency into safety and health risks inside federally assisted housing can be beneficial, but it is a lot like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg if you ignore the known hazards outside that unit. The sad truth is our assisted housing system is failing to protect residents from even more serious health threats than exist where we build our low-income housing structures. According to a report by the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, 70% of EPA Superfund sites are within 1 mile of public housing. To quote from a 2021 article from The Intercept, quote, "Housing officials often don't inform people who move into these housing complexes that a Superfund site is nearby. Neither the EPA nor HUD, the two federal agencies primarily responsible for protecting residents, regularly monitor the potential health threats to residents from nearby environmental pollution. In fact, some housing complexes near Superfund sites haven't been tested for contamination in years. The HUD Inspector General has estimated that approximately 17,000 HUD properties are located within 1 mile of an EPA Superfund site. But as the article noted, HUD is not, quote, required to test to determine if environmental hazards pose a threat to human health, unquote. This is a bureaucratic failure that puts many families and children at risk. My amendment would require an analysis by HUD and the EPA of the actual number of these facilities located within 1 mile of a Superfund site and would improve the underlying bill, in my assessment. This will give Congress real oversight opportunity to see how our current system is failing to provide safe housing opportunities. As some may recall, I offered a similar amendment last year at the Build Back Better markup, but unfortunately it was rejected by committee Democrats. I would hope we can all agree that we ought to be serious about addressing known health and safety hazards, but at the very least, we should make sure we are asking the right questions to identify those hazards in the first place. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there further debate on the amendment?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to be recognized.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I think much of the substance of this amendment it isn't even that objectionable. There is one aspect to this, however, that is concerning. In this amendment, we have the pro of including reporting and increased disclosure on Superfund sites in collaboration with the EPA. However, in the secondary aspect of this amendment, we have striking lines 17 and 18, which removes the secretary's or any secretary's discretion in including additional information that they believe should be included in reporting. Now, in the spirit of bipartisanship and in the spirit of attempting to pass this bill together, as opposed to simply along partisan lines, I was even amenable to take that knock, to take that negative, in order to accept the Republican amendment so that we can pass this bill together. Deal making, right? However, it has been made clear to me by the Republican side that even if I agreed to include the Republican amendment, the Republican side would still vote against the underlying bill. I think that in the spirit of collaboration and bipartisanship, we need to be introducing amendments that, if accepted, we can work together on. in that spirit, if we are going to weaken this bill without actually gaining any additional support for its passage, I would prefer that we introduce a bill with maximum transparency for all people. I also believe that this idea that this is a passive approach, we have attempted much more robust approaches on housing, including introducing a $150 billion investment on shoring up access to housing and federally assisted housing that also has been rejected. And so if there is objection to us not doing more, and if there is Republican agreement to do more in federally assisted housing, including investment, I'd be more than willing to have that conversation. However, given the opposition, this is what we've been capable of advancing at the moment. But again, if the Republican side would agree to support the bill, if their legislation and recommendations were included, I would be open and amenable. But since they have indicated that even if we accept the Republican side, they will still reject it no matter what, then I think we should advance with maximum transparency, support a bill that allows giving secretaries discretion, and if they'd like to return to the bargaining table in good and full faith, I will leave my office door open. Thank you so much. I yield back to the chair.
Is there further debate on the amendment? Hearing none, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. I am pleased to support H.R. 8476, but oppose the amendment offered by Mr. Rose. This committee has worked tirelessly to secure $150 billion in robust, fair, and affordable housing investments and continue to do so. This is even as many across the country face barriers to quality and safe housing. A few years ago, this committee responded when we learned of the deaths resulting from carbon monoxide poisoning in federally assisted housing. Thanks to bipartisan legislation from Mr. Garcia of Illinois, carbon monoxide detectors are now required in all federally assisted housing. Similarly, H.R. 8476 is one of several solutions that this committee has put forth following the tragic and unacceptable loss of life that families experienced after fires in the Bronx, New York, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now more than ever, it is incumbent upon Congress to strengthen our efforts to ensure the health, safety, and quality of federally assisted housing as our nation's housing crisis continues to accelerate. This includes being fully aware and transparent about the conditions of this housing. While the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Agriculture require routine inspections of federally assisted rental housing, the results of these inspections are not widely available to Congress on a routine basis, let alone the public. This is why H.R. 8476 would require HUD and USDA to annually report failing and unsatisfactory inspection scores, the reasons for those scores, the status of remediation of deficiencies, and other data to Congress. It would also require that this information be made publicly available through an online searchable database. While the underlying bill is a thoughtful piece of legislation, the amendment offered by Mr. Rose is not constructive to advancing this issue. His amendment would strike the discretion of the Secretary to provide Congress with information critical to understanding the housing hazards faced by people living in assisted housing. While I support Mr. Rose's efforts to identify public housing near Superfund sites, it is my understanding that even if we support his amendment, he will not support the underlying bill. Republicans would like to work with Democrats to support some of the most vulnerable people in the United States. We, of course, stand ready to work with them. So I thank Ms. Ocasio-Cortez for offering this important bill to increase transparency in federally assisted housing and better serve the families who live there. And I urge my colleagues to reject the Rose Amendment and support H.R. 8476. I yield back. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, I withdraw my point of order. The question now occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No? The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to the chair's previous order, the vote on this question is postponed. Is there further discussion of or amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, without objection, the previous question is ordered on H.R. 8476. And pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, further proceedings on the pending amendments are postponed. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 4277, the Overdraft Protection Act of 2021. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 4277.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 4277 is dispensed with. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of the substitute to H.R.
Without
4277.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York for 5 minutes to explain the bill and her amendment.
Thank you so much, and I thank my colleagues and Chair Lady Waters and Ranking Member McHenry for bringing this to this markup today. This is a bill that is extremely important to me and that I've worked on for a long time. It's a bill that's important to people who face challenges during COVID, during recessions, during inflation, and it will keep more of their hard-earned dollars in their pockets instead of unnecessary, in many cases exorbitant, fees. This bill's on a bill that we passed out of this committee jointly, a bipartisan bill called the Credit Card Bill of Rights. The Credit Card Bill of Rights saves consumers, according to the CFPB, $16 billion a year by cutting back on unfair, deceptive banking fees and keeping that money in their pockets, helping them during troubling times. The bill before us, the overdraft bill, does the same thing. It cuts back on unfair, necessary, deceptive fees, and it, according to the CFPB, will keep $8 billion a year minimum in consumers' pockets. It basically targets the most needy people in our country, people of low income that are caught with an overdraft fee. Sometimes the interest rates are so high that they're in a never-ending circle of poverty, just paying off overdraft fees. Rahm Emanuel, who was one of the chiefs of staff to President Obama, told me that during President Obama's years as president, the one thing that polled the best, because it affected so many lives and helped people, was the Credit Card Bill of Rights. This bill will do the same thing to help some of the most needy people in our country. The overdraft protection is a practice that began in good faith, and as a courtesy to banks, they'd extend it to customers for an occasional overdraft. In turn, overdraft fees were intended to be an occasional practice to compensate the bank for inconvenience. But this practice has become a high-cost line of credit and has become a reliable source of revenue for banks whose lowest-income customers are providing fee income to the tune of billions of dollars. One banking executive even named his yacht Overdraft as a symbol of how much money this had brought into his pockets. Overdraft fees drain billions of dollars from America's poor and working-class community every year. As I said, it is estimated during the height of the pandemic in 2020 to have reached double digits, and it cost consumers $8 billion. And these fees disproportionately target and penalize low-income consumers. The CFPB found that almost 80% of overdraft fees are borne by only 9% of consumers who are largely considered financially vulnerable. While I am grateful that some banks have finally taken the initiative themselves by eliminating and reducing the fees, it is gravely concerning to me that it has taken this long and that many banks still have not yet to make any voluntary change. And the banks are each enacting different policies, so it's not uniform. Consumers are left with little consistency and understanding of what these changes mean. We must ensure that there is a comprehensive, permanent solution to protect consumers from this legacy of predatory behavior. My bill, the Overdraft Protection Act, which will crack down on abusive, unfair, and deceptive overdraft fees, will limit overdraft fees that banks can charge customers to no more than one a month or 6 per year, and allows the CFPB to raise that limit if needed. It requires the fees to be reasonable and proportional to the amount overdrawn and the cost in providing coverage for the overcharge. We know that too often consumers are paying $35 in an overdraft fee for a $2 cup of coffee. It prevents institutions from posting transactions in an order that would maximize overdraft fees. Often what banking institutions do is they order them in a way that you pay your rent check first, throwing you into overdraft, and then smaller checks, they get the 35 fee for about 5 other checks. So it's really abusive to consumers. And it requires banks to have consumers to opt in. They let consumers decide whether or not they want this coverage. Often banks just automatically put them in. I'm seeing that my 5 minutes are almost up. I just ask unanimous consent to put in the record a listing of roughly 69 consumer organizations that have come out in support of this bill and are supporting it as a way to help people keep money, their hard money, earned money in their own pockets. I yield back as my time has expired.
Without objection, so moved. Is there further discussion of or amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lutkemeyer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Legislation before us would place additional restrictions and disclosures around overdraft fees. The number of restrictions included in this legislation would force many financial institutions, particularly small community institutions, to stop offering overdraft services altogether. I'm sure some of the members of the majority think that sounds great, but in reality, it would mean consumers have even less resources and services at their disposal to cover any unforeseen expenses. Besides the numerous notifications and disclosures this bill prescribes, it would also limit the number of overdraft coverage fees a consumer could receive to 1 per month and no more than 6 in a year. According to the Federal Reserve, 50% of Americans would have difficulty paying a $400 emergency expense. Despite this alarming fact, the actions of this committee and financial regulators aim to reduce consumers' ability to access short-term liquidity financial products. The majority in the administration have regulated banks out of small dollar loans. They want to eliminate overdraft and payday lenders and make disparaging comments on innovative products such as buy now, pay later, and earned wage access. This leaves consumers with little options when their car breaks down or their air conditioning turns off. Limiting the number of times the individual can use overdraft coverage is a dangerous provision that would only put consumers at risk. We cannot force consumers to play a game of chicken with their finances every month. That is not how the real world works. Just because your refrigerator breaks down in January doesn't mean your car will wait until February for a tire to blow. According to a study by global data intelligence firm Serenos, consumers do make highly informed choices about when to use overdraft services based on account information and clear disclosures of fees and procedures. This study found that 80% of overdraft transactions come from consumers who opted in, and 60% of the overdrafts come from consumers who intend to use the service. The truth is, consumers want access to short-term liquidity products to make sure they can cover an emergency expense. This is also reflected when you look at overdraft size. While my colleagues will continually mention overdraft fees caused by consumers to pay for a $40 cup of coffee, according to Serenos, the average size of a purchase that triggers an overdraft fee is almost $200. This would support the notion that overdraft purchases are used for larger items that are important to consumers. Even President Biden's acting comptroller, Sue, acknowledged the importance of overdraft products when he said, limiting overdrafts may limit the financial capacity for those who need it most. Furthermore, this legislation establishes the CFPB as a price setter in the consumer financial marketplace, something that goes well beyond the original statutory authority of Dodd-Frank. H.R. 4277 will allow the Bureau to establish a safe harbor for overdraft coverage fees that are reasonable, and I quote, reasonable and proportional to the amount of overdraft and the cost to the financial institution in providing overdraft coverage for the transaction, end quote. This vague provision grants an enormous amount of power to the CFPB, power it was not intended to have. When Dodd-Frank was debated and passed, it was clear the CFPB was not to act as a price setter of consumer financial products. This is evident in the text of Dodd-Frank, which specifically states, and I quote, no provision of this title shall be construed as conferring authority on the Bureau to establish a usury limit, end quote. The bill before us would dramatically alter the purpose of CFPB and make it a price-setting regulatory body, with almost no oversight with Congress
or the administration. And I'd like to make one more point here. In responding to the sponsor's comment about overdraft fees are to compensate the bank for the inconvenience of working on an overdraft, I'm sorry, that just doesn't fly. If you're a community banker, you need that money, that fee, to be able to pay for the money that you've advanced to the individual to pay that overdraft. Those costs are real. The cost of money today is there. It is for them to be able to help pay their and defer their costs for being able to provide this program. In short, this legislation is a drastic expansion of CPB authority and will eliminate options for the consumers who need it most. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing this bill to the table, and thank the Chairwoman Maloney for bringing it again. And it's so critical what she said. This is important bill, not just for districts like hers, but for mine and for so many across the country. Because quite frankly, people are sick and tired of some of these fees, and it's keeping some people from banking. And we should focus on ways to get more of our unbanked constituents into the banking system. Overwhelmingly, overdraft fees fall on those who can least afford it. It makes working people and minorities have even less than what they get in their paycheck. Because they live from paycheck to paycheck, these predatory overdraft fees pile up disproportionately, with 9% of consumers paying nearly 80% of all overdraft fees. This is a negative impact on working people and minorities. Latinos pay 3 times as much in checking account costs as their white counterparts per month. And overdraft fees fall on Black and Latino families due to systematic factors that leave them financially vulnerable, as Latino households are 1.4 times more likely, and Black households 1.9 times more likely to pay overdraft fees than white families. This important legislation that's being offered by Chairwoman Maloney will limit overdraft fees, curbing the practice that is lucrative for banks at the expense of hardworking Americans. Under this bill, banks will be limited to charging consumers a maximum of once per month and 6 times per 1 year. And fees will be reasonable and proportional to relation to the dollar amount overdrawn. Further, financial institutions will be prohibited from posting transactions in an order that maximizes overdraft fees and will be required to inform consumers of their overdraft fee practice in a straightforward and clear terms. People need to understand what they would face as a consequence. It is important that we protect our nation's working class communities from overdraft fees that intentionally target them, which is why I'm proud to support this legislation. And I thank again Chairwoman Maloney for her leadership in this effort, and I look forward to helping her get this bill through the process. And Mr. Chairman, I yield any remainder of my time to the Chairwoman if she has any more comments on her bill.
I thank the gentlelady for her comments, and I thank her for yielding the time. And I'd like to respond to Mr. Lukemeyer, my good friend, that we've worked together on so many good bills, but we disagree on this one. He said that this bill eliminates overdraft fees. That's not true. Right now, most banks just put people in automatically when they open up an account. This would require the consumer to make a choice and actively opt in. You can still opt in to overdraft fees if you so like, if you would so wish, but it cuts back on abusive, unfair policies, and that's what this bill does. And many people say that that overdraft fees are fair, but they really are excessive. They operate more like payday loans. From a consumer protection stance, these entities operate more like cash checkers and payday loans. Overdrafts are more expensive than most payday loans. For $35 to cover a $25 purchase is repaid in 2 days is equivalent to an annual percentage interest rate greater than 25,000%. And labeling this as a fee instead of a loan is not only deceptive, but also is unsustainable from a safety and soundness point of view. This bill simply rectifies this issue of outside fees by instituting limitations on the frequency of the fees and requiring regulators to institute rulemaking on making them reasonable and proportional to the charge caused by the bank, or therefore the bank. So we know that it has become a cash cow for many banks, and it really hits the lowest income people in our society. And many, I have talked to people that took out a overdraft fee and they never get out from under the debt. You know, every month they just have to pay the overdraft fee that is so huge in so many respects. So my time is expired, and I yield back.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to also express my strong opposition to my good friend, the gentlelady from New York's legislation. I know her heart is in the right place and it's well-intentioned, but I do not agree with the premise of this bill, H.R. 4277, the Overdraft Protection Act. I think the bill respectfully should be renamed Making Overdraft Protection Unaffordable Act, or even worse, the Overdraft Protection Elimination Act, because that's the effect of this bill. And I want to just say up front, consumers generally, by and large, know exactly what this product is, and they want it. There is a massive demand for it. This idea that this is a product that is worse or more usurious than payday loans is laughable. If you want to push more people into unaffordable payday products, this bill is the way to do it. You will have more uptake of payday loans, which my friends on the other side of the aisle say they hate payday loans, predatory lenders. This is a recipe for more payday loans. This is a recipe for more predatory loans. Overdraft protection is what Americans want. They don't want their card declined. They don't want the embarrassment at the point of sale of not having the transaction honored, and so they elect, and this is an important point that my friends on the other side of the aisle are not disclosing to the American people who are watching this right now. These consumers elect, they voluntarily choose overdraft protection. This bill would totally upend that framework, that disclosure framework, which was established in 2010, established by the Fed when they amended Reg E to require customers to opt in for overdraft protection. And this opt-in process involves clear pre-election disclosures and the ability to opt out. This bill would eliminate that consumer choice and replace it with a government mandate. This is an innovative product. Customers under current law knowingly opt in to receive the emergency safety net that overdraft provides. And for many, this is a financial cushion. I have heard firsthand from Kentuckians about their experiences with bank accounts and overdraft fees, and I think it's important to speak about these cases directly and not think about this in the abstract. My constituent, a young mother in Kentucky whose husband was in the military and deployed, had an emergency. Her car broke down. She needed it for work. She had to pay for the car repair but forgot that she didn't have sufficient funds in her checking account. The overdraft protection on that account that she chose, that she voluntarily elected so she wouldn't have to go to a high-cost payday loan, that protection on that account allowed her to address her emergency. She relayed that the fee that she paid was worth the convenience, it was worth the emergency coverage in that circumstance. I've heard many other stories similar to this one. So if we implement this policy, we will potentially eliminate the option for overdraft funds, and we are leaving everyday Americans like my constituent, the wife of a service member, in situations where they may not be able to access short-term liquidity that they rely on as a safety net. And in addition to the benefit of funding options for consumers, overdraft has found to be an innovative product. The study that my colleague from Missouri, Mr. Luchtenmeyer, pointed out, this Curinos study, found that most consumers are fully aware of the cost associated with tapping into these overdraft coverages and affirmatively chose to use this low-cost option in lieu of a payday loan because it was less expensive to cover the temporary funding shortfall. So let's not eliminate the ability of banks to offer overdraft. We should allow the market demand to incentivize banks to offer products that fit the needs of their customers. And final point, I don't want to hear any of this nonsense anymore from my friends on the other side of the aisle that, oh, well, we like community banks. We just don't like the big banks. We don't like the Wall Street banks. Let me tell you who can deal with this bill. I'll tell you who can deal with this bill, the global banks on Wall Street. They can afford this bill. And look, my friend from New York, she represents those banks. There's nothing wrong with those banks. They serve a purpose in that segment of the market. And I appreciate her advocacy for those large institutions. But you know who cannot afford this legislation? The small community bank with $250 million in assets on the corner of downtown Mount Sterling, Kentucky. They will eliminate this product. And my constituents in Mount Sterling and in Winchester and in Paris, Kentucky, and in Nicholasville, Kentucky, and Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, you know what will be left for them when they have a cash shortfall? A high-cost payday loan. So no more am I going to tolerate hearing from the other side of the aisle, oh, well, we're for the community banks, because this is a killer for community banks and their small-town customers. I yield back.
I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to thank Representative Maloney for offering H.R. 4277, the Overdraft Protection Act of 2021. For too long, banks have gotten away with charging excessive overdraft fees. At the height of the pandemic, when so many consumers were struggling to make ends meet, large banks were padding their profit margins by raking in more than $12 billion of these fees in 2020 alone. In fact, expert analysis has found that banks have increased their revenues from service charges in recent years to make up for interest lost in the low interest rate environment we've had going back to the Great Recession. As consumers are recovering from the pandemic and struggling with inflation, many banks are still hitting consumers while they're down by charging these junk fees. I'm especially troubled by data showing that consumers of color are paying twice as much in these fees as white consumers. Now let's be clear, this bill does not ban overdraft products, but rather codifies and improves on reasonable limitations based on prior regulatory actions, including FDIC supervisory guidance that deemed 6 overdrafts per year as excessive for consumers, and rules issued by the Federal Reserve ensuring consumers must opt in to overdraft service. This bill also complements the committee's work in conducting megabank oversight, where we have pressed their CEOs to reduce these costly fees. We must continue to pass bills like H.R. 4277 in order to put a check on financial institutions which have preyed on consumers during turbulent financial times. Consumer responses to the CFPB's recent request for information on junk fees show just how harmful these fees can be. Now, the minority would have us believe that those $12 billion in revenues are needed by the banks in order to cover their short-term costs of liquidity. But listen to what one consumer said. I'm a low-income, first-generation student who is trying to earn a college degree. Needless to say, money is tight. My bank, being unexpectedly overdrawn, made it so I couldn't afford necessities such as toothpaste and toilet paper. I think that's worth $12 billion. There's a lot of rhetoric here about consumer protection, but I think this bill is a chance for us to make sure that our actions match our words and put consumers first. I urge members to support H.R. 4277, and I yield back the balance of my time. Is there further discussion of or amendment to H.R. 4277? If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 4277 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes overwhelmingly have it. The ayes have it, and 4277 is agreed. Is agreed to. Pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, the vote on this question is postponed.
Did they call for a vote? Did they call for a vote?
No, you are correct. I apologize.
They haven't called for a vote.
HR 4277 is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, we'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, the vote on this question is postponed.
We almost got it through with that vote. Thank you.
Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up HR 8485, the Expanding Access to Credit Through Consumer Permission Data Act. The clerk will report the bill.
HR
Without objection,
8485.
the first reading of HR 8485 is dispensed with. The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base tax for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Georgia for 5 minutes to explain the bill and her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for rocking and rolling today. Hello, everyone. I would first like to let you know that I'm joining you from my home in Atlanta as I recover and isolate from a case of COVID that I caught last week. I know that markups can be long and hard, but y'all, I will take that over being sick any day of the week. But today I am proud to bring my bill with my colleague Carter here, who decided to join me. I decided to bring my bill, the Expanding Access to Credit Through Consumer Permission Data Act, before the committee for consideration. Y'all, 45 million people do not have enough credit history to be accurately scored, and many of them are our family, our friends, and our neighbors.
Yes.
So think of the recent college graduate who has a great job, but y'all can barely get a credit card, much less a home loan. The neighbor who's made decades worth of on-time rental payments, but a home loan would be their first loan. Or the friend who hasn't been using credit often enough lately, but yet they still want to buy a home and should be able to do so. So these are the types of folks that are at risk of being credit invisible. And those who are credit invisible often can't get the loan that they need to buy a home, even if they've worked hard and can make the payments. We all know someone who's faced barriers to getting a home loan because of their lack of traditional credit information. And if you don't yet know or didn't think you knew someone, well, now you do. Because y'all, personally, I know what it's like to not have my credit score reflect my true promise. Years ago, I was unbanked. I lived paycheck to paycheck as a public school teacher. I lived and continue to live strapped with student loan debt. It was hard for me to get into home ownership because my credit score just didn't reflect my hard work or credit worthiness. And this isn't an unusual story for a lot of people who look like me. Disproportionately, those who are credit invisible are people of color. So fast forward to today, y'all. I'm a congresswoman, and my husband Leslie and I own our home. And now that I'm here, y'all, I am determined to open the door to help other people who are starting where I did, to represent their true potential to mortgage lenders. And when we do that, we can expand access to affordable home ownership opportunities, which will help us close the racial wealth gap. My bill tasks lenders with considering additional credit information not usually found on a credit report when the consumer makes a request that this information be included. And I'm talking about things like rental payment history, bank statement information, and pay stubs. Some lenders are already using alternative credit information to gain a better understanding of an applicant's credit qualifications. Democrats and Republicans alike have long called for expanding the use of alternative credit information. And I think we can all agree that alternative credit data can help predict who will be a good homeowner. My bill will help us make sure that we're moving forward on alternative credit information the right way by focusing on data that is supplied with the consumer's permission, by making sure creditors give this data the same weight and treatment as credit bureau data, and by making sure that everyone has the chance to present this information to their lender, no matter their zip code and no matter the size of their bank account. My bill simply builds on Regulation B, which already allows for the consideration of consumer permission alternative credit information and empowers consumers to present more information to their mortgage lender when their traditional credit information just doesn't cut it. We should be giving everyone who does the hard work a chance to succeed. And my bill is an important common sense step forward to increase affordable home ownership opportunities. And I encourage all committee members to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman from.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the gentlewoman from Georgia's intent with this bill, which is to increase access to credit for consumers with thin or no credit files. This is a laudable goal, and in the past, there has been bipartisan agreement to include alternative data such as rent, utility, and telecom payments in consumer credit reports, which would further this goal. Unfortunately, this bill takes a different approach. Instead of allowing the private sector to continue to innovate and include more predictive alternative data, this bill would follow what appears to be the majority's favorite way of legislating. Let the agencies do it, specifically in this case, the CFPB. H.R. 8485 would codify a current requirement in Regulation B for mortgage lenders to consider additional credit information not typically included in a consumer's credit report if the consumer requests it to be considered. However, the bill also adds many overly prescriptive requirements for mortgage lenders to comply with a straightforward task already in regulation. It requires lenders to give notice to mortgage applicants regarding the types of alternative data that can be considered. However, it also grants the CFPB director the discretion to establish that form language and therefore allowing him to decide what data can and cannot be used. If the CFPB, which is already an unaccountable agency, forces mortgage creditors to accept information that is not predictive, it would effectively weaken the ability of creditors to prudently underwrite mortgage loans. The result would drive up the cost of all loans and cut off access for many home buyers. If we cannot be honest with ourselves, everyone in this room knows Director Chopra's only motive behind any list he would develop would be his ability to sue or publicly disparage American businesses based on whatever information the Bureau demands. It has been made clear that the cost and availability of financial products plays little to no role in the Bureau's decision-making process. In addition, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association, the average mortgage is now more than 500 pages. In the past, we've had mortgage lenders in this committee who claim they no longer measure mortgages by the page, they measure it by the pound. This committee should be working on streamlining the mortgage lending process to ensure homebuyers fully understand the requirements placed upon them. This legislation would include significant more paperwork, all in an attempt to codify something that is already in regulation. Not only is the use of additional credit information already in regulation, but the credit bureaus have also made significant strides to accept alternative data for years. All three major bureaus have programs to accept alternative data to bring predictive data to individuals with thin or no credit files. The fact is, this bill is duplicative and overly broad, and an overly broad effort that will only increase the cost of mortgage lending, and those costs will ultimately be passed on to the consumer. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
I thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at this bill. I rise in support of this bill, and I'm very proud to be a co-sponsor of Representative Williams' legislation, H.R. 8485. And as the mission of the bill states in the beginning, at least in part, it states that using alternative data in mortgage lending has the potential to increase access to credit for individuals with little or no credit history with the national reporting agencies, thus having the opportunity to establish credit and seek home ownership. Democrats and Republicans, consumer advocates, and financial institutions broadly agree that alternative credit data has tremendous potential to expand access to credit and create a more equitable financial system. We've had many conversations in this committee about the desirability of incorporating alternative data into credit scores and its potential to help responsible, credit-worthy renters who want to transition to home ownership but lack the traditional credit data needed to secure high-quality mortgage loans. We know we have a serious problem when it comes to who can achieve home ownership in this country. It's a statistic that has been cited many times in this committee, but it bears repeating. The 30% gap between black and white home ownership in this country is today larger than it was in 1940. That is unconscionable. In my district, which includes Montgomery and Berks County, Pennsylvania, White ownership rate is 76.5%, while black home ownership rate is 45.9%, according to the National Association of Realtors, which puts the black-white home ownership gap in my district at just over 30%. It's shameful and untenable. The gap is mirrored in the credit score distribution. According to Urban Institute data in Montgomery County, nearly 10% of residents in majority-white communities have a subprime credit score, whereas 30% of residents in communities of color have a subprime credit score. Allowing consumers to have additional alternative data considered during the mortgage application process could help make high-quality loans available to consumers who have subprime traditional credit scores and are credit invisible, helping more people, especially people of color, considering the demographics of credit scores currently, achieve affordable home ownership. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this worthy legislation, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
She had to go to the other committee.
Does he want to speak or does he have?
Okay. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized.
We have a parliamentary inquiry. Am I offering an amendment now? Are you?
Yes. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek
I have
recognition?
an amendment at the desk.
We will pause to allow copies of the amendment to be distributed electronically. Have all members received the amendment? If so, I would like to reserve a point of order on this amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
I thank the chairman. First of all, let me start out by thanking Congresswoman Williams for her keen work on her bill and her sincere efforts to reach out over the months to my office to see how we could work together on this topic, because the idea of additional data benefiting people and thus benefiting their credit score and thereby increasing their opportunity for credit is a real common agenda of this committee on both sides of the aisle, and particularly for those of low and moderate incomes. It's expensive to be poor, and I know the benefit and the potential of additional credit information. And as my good friend from Texas, Mr. Green, always tells us, saying additional credit information is far better than saying alternative data. So I hope everybody in this debate will use the word additional. So this bipartisan support is significant, but I have concerns about H.R. 8485 as drafted. I think it's overly prescriptive on mortgage lenders. I think it grants way too much discretion and new rulemaking authority to the CFPB. I don't think after Mr. Chopra's 10 months at the Bureau, it doesn't give me any confidence in his ability to handle that in the right way. So if the CFPB were to force mortgage lenders to accept information that's not predictive, it ends up weakening the ability to prudently underwrite mortgage loans, and this in turn would drive up the cost of all loans, actually cutting off access to many home buyers. So my worry is that the bill as drafted unintentionally could do the opposite of what our good friend Ms. Williams from Georgia intends by increasing the cost of mortgage lending, which ultimately then is passed on to the borrower and may in fact cause credit to be restricted. The goal of this Congress and the goal in this topic is balance. How do we balance using more additional data to therefore increase the number of people eligible for credit while doing that in a safe and sound way for those who are extending that credit? And that's why I have this substitute amendment that would replace the underlying bill with my legislation, the Credit Access and Inclusion Act. This legislation would amend the Fair Credit Reporting Act to allow, but not mandate, public housing authorities, utility companies, and phone companies to report full file payment to credit reporting agencies, and directs the GAO to study the impact of furnishing this, as my friend Mr. Green would say, additional information for the benefit of consumers. Now, let me remind my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that this bill was originally a Keith Ellison bill, a bill voiced out of this committee, voted out of this committee 60-0 just 5 years ago. I was proud to co-sponsor this bill with Mr. Ellison, now the Attorney General of Minnesota. That means that 16 of my Democratic colleagues who are currently members of this committee already have voted for this legislation. I've been working for months to find a Democratic co-lead, and it's disappointing to see my friends on the other side of the aisle no longer support an idea that Keith Ellison and I thought was an outstanding way to boost credit availability while balancing our safety and soundness concerns. So I asked my friends, why bother even having a credit score if we're not going to report the data? Are we going to abolish grades at school? Are we going to tell Olympic athletes they all get gold medals? Should every student get an A in class? The key is that credit scores are to be predictive and measure risk, and therefore allow people to have access to credit. That additional data opens up millions of dollars of credit for millions of families not currently accessible in credit. So I'm afraid it's not a little surprising because President Biden, in fact, campaigned on a platform that explicitly called for a new government-run credit reporting agency at the CFPB. I have to say, for the record, what a terrible idea. And you find in the findings of Congresswoman Williams' bills, you point out 45 million consumers don't have any credit history. Let's work together to promote credit history for those people in a safe and sound way. So I urge my colleagues, let's vote yes on a bill that French Hill and Keith Ellison have recommended to this committee for 5 years. Let's get a yes, let's get more people access to credit, and let's do it in a safe and sound way that benefits the American people. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I appreciate Congressman Hill's work on this important issue and the conversations that our staff has been having around legislation in this area, I think that there are ways that we can all work together on this issue. But unfortunately, that's not what this amendment does at all. It doesn't build on or improve my bill that is before us today. What it does is fully eliminates my bill and weakens the ability of consumers to authorize relevant data to be provided to their lenders. If we gut this bill, consumers that have things like rental history to provide to their lender won't have the same power to offer that information. They have to hope that their credit scores will eventually incorporate information that will bring them out of credit invisibility and into homeownership. Credit invisible consumers can no longer afford to wait. They have rental payment history and other documentation to provide now. Many lenders are already considering this type of information without a problem. So it's about time that Congress provides the guidance that lenders and consumers need to expand this opportunity to everyone. Now, Congressman Hill, your approach to expanding access to additional credit, if that's what you want to call it, is different. It amends FCRA instead of ECOA. Our approaches are not mutually exclusive. I'm sure we can find a way to work together in a way that is both bipartisan and supported by consumer groups. And in fact, former Congressman William Lacy Clay offered an amendment to the Comprehensive Credit Act just last Congress that is similar to yours. And it got a bipartisan vote and has the support of consumer groups. So I urge you to withdraw your amendment, Congressman Hill, so that we can work together in good faith on approaches like this instead of just eliminating and gutting the bill before us today. But if you insist on striking and gutting my approach with an unrelated approach, then I'll have to oppose it and urge all of my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman. Can I recognize her? Do I?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Okay. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you. I think that the gentleman from Arkansas has got a great approach here. This is a bill that we've all worked on, we've seen, we've vetted. We know what it does, what it doesn't do. I think that we need to be able to give his bill his amendment as much consideration as possible. And to that end, I want to yield as much time as he may need to the gentleman from Arkansas.
Well, I thank my friend from Missouri, and I appreciate my friend from Georgia's comments, and as she notes, our efforts to work together, but also to work separately to benefit folks in this country who need access to building their credit file in an effective way and thus have more access to credit. But H.R. 8485, as it's drafted and we have before us today, codifies a current requirement in Reg B for mortgage lenders to consider additional credit information not typically included on a consumer's credit report if the consumer requests it. But as drafted, it has a lot of overly, as I noted, prescriptive requirements for mortgage lenders to comply with a task that's already in regulation, and it gives discretion to the CFPB for new rulemaking authority, which I don't think is constructive. And I reiterate my key point about this. Anytime we're suggesting that we want to have additional data to try to enhance the credit record for one of our families so they have a better shot at access to credit, but it is not the full record, it's not predictive, and it's somehow cherry-picked. Like we've had a debate in this House before. Well, you can report additional data, but if it's detrimental, it can't be included in the record. Well, that's not a credit score. That weakens the ability to build out a pool of data that benefits all Americans that rely on that consumer reporting data and our lenders who want to do a safe and sound manner. And this has huge ramifications, particularly in the mortgage area, as all mortgages, or 9 out of 10 mortgages, are put in a security form. If it's a first-time home buyer, a lower balance mortgage, it might be an FHA loan that's rolled into a Ginnie Mae government-backed mortgage. If it's something larger, it might be in a Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae mortgage. And so you have huge ramifications for credit quality. And this country's already been through a mortgage crisis in the mid-2000s that almost crashed the whole world's economy. So we want to balance access to credit, predictive data, fairly described, including consumer preferences, but do it in a way that's safe and sound. I think my approach is preferred, and why, again, I appreciate the hard work of my good friend from Georgia. I prefer my bill and my approach. I think it's more fair to the combination, that balance of access to credit, more data available on the record for those 45 million Americans that want to build a credit file, but produces and preserves safety and soundness in this particular instance for the mortgage credit system. And I yield back to my friend from Missouri, and thank you.
Thank the gentleman for his concise comments, and just wanted to elaborate a little bit as well. Very concerned about the, again, allowing even more authority to the CFPB. That is the wrong agency to give any more authority to. And in fact, with the recent decision with the two coal companies that sued the EPA, the Supreme Court said that they could only do, the agencies could only do whatever the law says they could do with regards to the administration's agencies making new rules and regulations. This would again give more power to the CFPB in doing, in regulating this disclosure of information. I think this is the wrong direction to go. I'm very concerned about it. I think that while the bill is well intended, I think that the gentleman from Arkansas has got a great compromise here to be able to, again, address this issue in a way that actually works, that is fair, that allows for people to have predictive information on their credit scores so that there is a fair score for their particular situation, that gives them the best chance they can at an affordable rate on their mortgages. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I rise to support the original amendment in nature of a substitute, the Expanding Access to Credit through Consumer Permission Data Act, and against the substitute amendment. I agree with the sponsor of the bill that this would effectively gut her bill and is not in line with any of the intent of her bill. So I rise to speak in favor against the amendment and in favor of the underlying bill. About 45 million individuals in the United States do not have credit history with the National Credit Reporting Agencies, NCRA. This lack of credit history precludes these individuals from essential financial activity like mortgage lending. In Texas alone, 86.6% of its residents have a credit score with NCRA. This leaves about 13.4% of Texas adults credit invisible. And Black and Latino individuals, both in Texas and across the nation, are more likely to be without NCRA credit. This important legislation would require lenders to consider additional credit information, not just credit scores from NCRAs in the evaluation of mortgage applications. I am dedicated to expanded mortgaging services for all Texans and all Americans. This bill is another step forward in the right direction in the name of financial inclusion. I thank Congresswoman Williams for her leadership on this issue, and I wish her full recovery in regards to the little helper you had earlier in your presentation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, move to strike the last word. Just building on the good commentary of a colleague there from Texas. I support H.R. 8485, but strongly oppose Mr. Hill's amendment to strike the entirety of Ms. Williams's bill with his own. If our colleague wants to promote the inclusion of additional data that would be helpful to mortgage applicants in a truly meaningful and beneficial way, then he would not strike this entire bill itself. According to the CFPB, nearly 45 million consumers lack a credit score, either because they have insufficient or no credit history. And research shows that consumers without a credit score have a difficult time getting credit cards and bank loans. Lenders that will issue these consumers credit will do so on less favorable terms. This bill will codify and elevate a safeguard which allows consumers to request that a mortgage lender consider additional financial information, such as rental payment history, to demonstrate their credit worthiness when their credit file does not give a full picture of their qualifications. The lender would be required to notify applicants of their right to offer this additional data. Examples of this type of information that would be considered. And unless the lender has reason to believe the information provided is a misrepresentation, they must consider this information when underwriting the loan. So by allowing consumers the ability to share additional credit information such as on-time rental payments and cash flow data from their bank account, lenders can get a more accurate and better picture of consumers' true credit worthiness, making it more likely that consumers will qualify for mortgage loans and on better terms. Unfortunately, our colleague's amendment would strike the underlying provisions of the bill, and rather than empowering consumers, would instead turn that decision over to utility companies about whether or not to send the data to the consumer file, regardless of whether it would help or harm a consumer and without the consumer's permission. Data from utility companies and regulators shows that the percentage of low-income and energy assistance utility customers who are delinquent can range from 17 to 38%. This is understandable, as when consumers are struggling to pay their bills, they are often advised to skip their utility bills because the company can't turn off their utilities. As a result, Mr. Hill's bill would make it more unlikely that a customer would not qualify for any loan, credit card, or other financial product. Ms. Williams' bill is supported by several consumer advocates, including Consumer Reports, Liberation in a Generation, the National Consumer Law Center on behalf of its low-income clients, Public Citizen, and Unidos US. I urge my colleagues to reject the Hill Amendment and to pass H.R. 8484. I yield back.
Is there further debate in the amendment? If not, I withdraw my point of order. The question now occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous order. The vote on this question is postponed. Is there further discussion of or amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? We have a recorded vote. Yes. Yes. That's what I said. If there are no further amendments without objection, the previous question is ordered on H.R. 8485 and pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, further proceedings on the pending amendments are postponed.
Oh, okay. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 8478, the Credit Reporting Accuracy After a Legal Name Change Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 8478, a bill to amend the Fair Credit Reporting Act to require nationwide consumer reporting agencies, upon request, to use a consumer's current legal name on consumer reports and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as a credit reporting accuracy after a Legal Name Change Act of 2022. Section 2, findings. Congress finds the following.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 8478 is dispensed with. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8478.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered. Base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the bill and my amendment. As the Congresswoman representing the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, 7th, I am proud to be home to the second largest LGBTQ plus community in the nation. The LGBTQ community, like many marginalized communities, has unique experiences and areas of discrimination, threats, and overlook, including when it comes to consumer rights and protections. My bill, the Credit Reporting Accuracy After a Legal Name Change Act, will rectify the inequities and inaccuracies in credit reporting which disproportionately impact transgender and non-binary individuals. During their transition, many transgender people choose to legally change their name. However, even after their legal name change is finalized, their credit report continues to dead name them or refer to them by their prior name. Dead naming a trans person in their credit report comes with great harm to one's financial and mental health. When external entities receive these inaccurate credit reports, transgender individuals are exposed to discrimination and harassment in credit services, housing, and employment. My bill will prohibit consumer reporting agencies from disclosing a consumer's dead name in a credit report upon request. This will help prevent discrimination by lenders, landlords, and hiring managers that receive credit reports because they will no longer be able to infer a person's gender identity based on their prior names. Furthermore, some trans and non-binary consumers have reported that when they change their name, the credit bureaus fragment their credit report, resulting in a loss of credit history. This fragmentation can be severely harmful, directly contributing to credit score decreases of 100 points or more, which increases barriers to accessing mortgages, auto financing, employment, and rental housing. My bill will fix this issue by directing the CFPB to ensure that the information in consumers' prior names is included in their current reports. This will improve accuracy in consumer reporting and prevent unfair denials that result from a loss of credit history or score after a name change. The status quo is unjust, inaccurate, and unsafe for transgender and non-binary people. And we know that the credit bureaus can easily make these changes. Decades ago, they enacted solutions for people who changed their last name due to marriage or divorce. We're not seeking preferential treatment here, just equitable. It's time that those solutions are extended to the transgender community, which is exactly what my bill would do. My bill has the support of key advocates and trusted voices, but most importantly, it is endorsed by transgender and non-binary people who have been personally impacted by these issues. I want to thank my colleagues, Representatives Richie Torres and Chuy Garcia, who have joined on in support of this important bill. By voting for this critical legislation, we can make a small correction that will have a big impact to advance economic justice for the trans community. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Madam Chair, I move to strike last word.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Littermacher, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the work of you on this issue, but I'm fearful this legislation would have significant unintended consequences. This legislation seeks to make it easier for individuals who have legally changed their name to remove their dead name from their credit file. First, I'm concerned that this bill is a solution in search of a problem. Credit bureaus have made significant strides in this area and released additional guidance earlier this year regarding name changes on a credit file. For changes of just a last name, notification to banks and creditors will suffice, as the credit bureaus will learn of this change through the systems used by the lender or creditor. If you are changing your first and last name, you simply have to call the credit bureaus or use their online customer support systems. Since the credit bureaus have significant processes in place to handle name changes, legislating this process will only add unnecessary red tape and could result in a loss of credit data for consumers or worse. Generally speaking, access to former names of individuals after marriage, divorce, or adoption helps with a smooth transition in the event that an individual is applying for new forms of credit. The dead name as an individual is also used frequently after an individual changes their name in many examples that directly benefit consumers, including when they apply for certain public benefits like SNAP, Section 8, or unemployment insurance. In addition, the dead name of an individual is often used in instances where child support is owed to a woman or child. Fully removing a former name from a credit file could have serious and significant impact on consumers. One comment I was concerned about and kind of a question in my own mind in your opening statement was it says caused financial and mental health problems. I'd be anxious to see studies that show that it causes financial problems or causes mental health problems. I've never heard of that one before, but I'd certainly be willing to take a look at any studies you may have to show that. Again, I appreciate the goal of the speaker or the chairman today, and with that, I must oppose the legislation and that I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership in bringing forward this very important bill that's important not only, of course, to your community in the Boston area, but to mine in the Houston area. I'm always proud to stand with the trans community. No one should have to live in fear of being who they are in the United States. And use of a trans individual's former name can represent a painful misrepresentation of their true identity. This straightforward legislation will require nationwide consumer reporting agencies to use consumers' current legal names on consumer reports. There are approximately 92,900 trans individuals in my home state of Texas, and I know that the process is not easy. It's a legal process that takes time, takes money, takes lawyers, and to suggest that someone would do this just to be able to get away from paying their debts, quite frankly, is laughable. I am determined to stand up for the rights of every one of those in Texas and across the country in every way I can for their safety, their financial inclusion, and for broad success. Too often, our nation's trans community does not receive even the most basic respect, and I am glad that this legislation marks a small step forward in codifying protections. With the reforms included in this bill, it will help prevent discrimination in credit, housing, and employment by protecting transgender consumer gender identities on their consumer reports. The bill will also ensure clear and transparent processes that it will exist for transgender and non-binary consumers to update their consumer reports. This is so important, Madam Chair and sponsor of the bill. That is something that's really been needed for a long time. I am just so pleased that you have brought it forward, and I stand with you in supporting this bill. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Is there further discussion of or amendment to H.R. 8478? If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The Question now occurs on ordering H.R. 8478 as amended. Be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, the vote on this question is postponed. The committee will stand in recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.